What's up, brother? It's your boy, Mike Muse. Welcome to the Conversation, the Mike Muse Show. I am so excited to be in conversation with you. It is a town hall. And you know, there's one thing that we love here at the Mike Muse Show is a town hall. We love to be live. We love to be in front of an audience. And I love being in front of an audience when it is a very complicated conversation and topic and subject matter. Because, you know, I love talking all things technology, all things policy, all things geopolitics. So this is like Christmas for me. Christmas in September has come early because I have some of the most brilliant minds who are day-to-day, 9 to 5, thinking about safety, protection, and community through online and through technology. AI is all the buzzword. It is either the boogeyman word or it is the word that brings you hope and excitement. I often, too, have to remind myself that I need to be a little bit more contained about my excitement about AI, but this is why I have some members of the oversight board to moderate my excitement, no pun intended. But I'm so excited. Meta is trailblazing in certain areas when it comes to content moderation, having oversight, and holding themselves accountable with self-regulation in a way where our Congress and federal government oftentimes is lagged behind. You've often heard me say that I truly believe that Congress, I'm going to give Congress a little bit of grace. You know, Congress always rides you, but that you have been learning much more quickly about AI and technology. But when it comes to regulating and policy and creating legislation, you guys are a little bit of beat behind, but that's just the nature of the way our Congress works. And so I do appreciate the value that Meta is trying to step in and do some more self-regulation. But enough of me. I want to introduce some fantastic panelists here who are going to help me moderate this. And let's figure out what is happening from the day-to-day within Meta and the oversight board. So first, to my left, I had the chance to meet this dynamic individual last year, and her conversation left me tickled, I would say. So I'm excited to have her. She is brilliant. She is incredibly talented. She's the director and head of governance at Meta. Prior to Meta, Louise worked at a newspaper and broadcast litigator in the UK for over a decade, so she knows a thing or two about journalism. What's up, Louise Turner?
Hello, and thank you so much for having me. This isn't our usual confines, and it's way more glamorous, so thank you so much.
How are you feeling today?
Yeah, I'm feeling really good. We just came from a panel at the Concordia conference, which was super interesting, and then straight on to you, so you're bringing the joy for sure.
I feel like when Brits talk, they have that accent that makes them automatically seem smart, right?
That's what I hide behind.
No, I'm like, let the accent come out, like on your brilliant.
Should I go posher? Should I?
Oh yeah, I mean this is United Nations
so
Week. Go in, like own your truth, friend. Cheers, mate.
Yes.
And to the right, I have also someone who I had the chance to meet last year, who was also a hoot. I have enjoyed our conversation that we have on a very high intellectual level, and also too from a very basic humorous level too as well. This dynamic lady is incredibly brilliant, as she is equal parts fun and funny. She is part of the oversight board. She's a former electoral counselor at the National Electoral Institute in Mexico, and is also too a lawyer in Mexico City. She is currently an international consultant on elections, democracy, and human rights, particularly in countries facing polarization and violence. I mean, how perfect are you for this oversight board? The dynamic Pamela San Martin, what's happening?
Yeah, it's so good to be here with you, Mike, and especially in this very unusual setting.
Oh yeah,
which makes it so much more fun because I think it can make a conversation more dynamic.
It can,
and it can make a conversation that is usually like placed in like very intellectual, academic spaces. Set it in a way that we can all understand, that we can all talk about it.
Yeah.
And stop a little bit of the siding things, of seeing that one side is right, one side is wrong, but actually learning from each other.
What's up with these accents? Because you have an incredible accent too as well. It just adds to a little mystique about you.
I was about to say that I was going to feel discriminated because I did not have the British accent or the American accent.
But you had that Latin accent.
It has
that love language.
It has some of a feeling to it, and I shall talk with my hands like a good Latin.
Yeah, it's very compassionate, right? It's very emotional based driven.
You can't talk without emotions. You can't think without emotions, because that's part of our daily life. And if we try to not see that, we're going to make a mistake, I think.
Yeah.
I feel like the Brits give it a good shot.
Yeah, I do too. So,
emotion.
I mean, I want to know, what do I sound like? Because I don't think I have an accent. You can judge me. You can be very critical.
You don't think you have an American accent?
I don't think I have an American accent.
You have a singing voice.
Oh, Ooh la la.
In Spanish, we would say cantadito. That like if you were singing when you're
Sí.
talking.
You have an amazing radio voice.
Sí, caliente. And before we get in trouble with all the things and people in HR, I'm going to bring the next person to my right, who also too is on the oversight board, Chief Executive Officer at PEN American, author of Dare to Speak, defending free speech for all. I mean, you guys pick the right people for this oversight board because everything you guys do in your work appeals to what it is we're discussing when it comes to freedom of speech and freedom of expression. This dynamic individual served on the Obama administration as Deputy Assistant Secretary for State for International Organizations, leading U.S. engagement in the United Nations, and the Clinton administration as Deputy to the U.S. Ambassador of UN Management and Reform. Suzanne Nozzle, we are not worthy of you and your presence today. How do you feel?
I feel great. I think I'm the only New Yorker among the guests here, so that's a point of pride. Happy to be at home and excited for the conversation. It's always kind of a buzzing week in New York City when everyone comes in for the UN General Assembly, so we're kind of feeding off that energy.
Yeah, but I think New Yorkers have a very distinct accent that is such a melting pot of global cultures and communities.
Right. We all think we have no accent. I think they each think they have no accent. The problem is us. They're just being polite about it.
I feel like you're about to order bacon, egg, and cheese at any minute.
It could happen. It has been known to happen.
Okay, Saturday morning, are you bacon, egg, and cheese or are you lox?
Lox. Oh, my God.
What type of bagel?
Everything.
Same.
Toasted everything.
Capers?
Yeah. There's, bring it on.
Bring it
the
on, everything.
Onion, we have Kosar's just opened up right across the street. You know that place?
Yeah, of course, yeah.
It's like a 75-year-old New York staple with bagels and lox and whitefish and like all the fixins.
Oh, you are a New Yorker.
I think you don't have in either Mexico City or London, is my guess.
Because I'm from the Midwest, I alternate between the bacon, egg, and cheese and the lox. When I feel like being fancy and elitist, I do lox and a bagel. When I feel like being like regular, I do bacon, egg, and cheese.
It's the salt. Like
It's the
let's
salt.
Just be honest.
It's a great
the
hangover
salt,
cure.
yeah.
Okay, well, we're heading to a wrong direction. Let me pull out quickly because I'm talking about hangovers already.
If not, I'm going to start complaining that you're talking about bagels when you have a Mexican here where we have quesadillas, where we have tacos, where we have enchiladas, chiles. Come on.
Have
Oh
fish
my
and
God.
chips.
That is food.
Yeah.
My biases have already been included, which is a great jump off point
Right.
because I'm like, well, do we add avocado? That is my ignorant speaking, right? Of just not being aware. And I would moderate, I guess, in a breakfast burrito that I wouldn't do salsa in mine. Do you put salsa in yours?
I do not eat a burrito. I eat a taco. I eat a quesadilla. I eat
What do you have
everything.
against burritos?
Burritos is the American logic of what Mexican
Oh, really?
food
It's
looks
like a
like.
perversion.
Wow.
Yeah.
So
I
you're
mean, it's good. It's just not
It's like a
what
little
us
embarrassing
Mexicans
that
would
I
think.
didn't know that. I've been eating
No.
it all these years.
But we do eat salsa and very hot salsa, and oof, that will be delicious.
okay, but you avocados or no? Or is that too American?
Avocados? No, we eat avocados. We have guacamole.
Oh, that's what you do.
Yeah, we put a little chili in there, a little onion, a
Yeah.
little tomato. Oof.
So audience, what you don't realize is that was actually a case study of content moderation right there. That this is exactly what the dynamic of content moderation is about inserting human biases when it comes to that. And that's why we have right now this dynamic of do we use AI for automation in terms of looking at content moderation, or do we use humans' existence into it? But the challenge though, when you bring humans into the dynamic of trying to figure out what content should remain up or not, it's all about your lived experience, right? And so this discourse that we had very organically and naturally did not know we're going to derive to this, but I'm from the Midwest. And so for me, a good morning comfort is bacon, egg, and cheese. So I wouldn't see anything wrong with that. The East Coast is very popular to have lox. In Mexico, you do neither, right? And then the New Yorkers and Americans were talking about the idea of calling it a burrito, and you say taco, where the Brits do bangers and sauce and beans.
Mash.
And so we haven't even got
And
to
a lot
that.
of stealing everybody else's cuisines,
Right.
I think.
So for my oversight board committee, Pamela, just right there, talk to us about the challenge and the dynamic when it comes to content moderation and how we all bring our biases to the table. And then how then do you eliminate biases when it comes to what content should be removed and should stay?
You're completely right. Both humans and machines bring bias into content moderation. But what you have to do is try to analyze how to take that bias out, how to make a diverse body. I'm going to give you the example of the oversight board. Of course, every single person in the oversight board has a background, has a view of things, has an ideology of things. But when we come together, we try to understand how certain content will impact different places, different communities, which standards should be set to be able to guarantee free speech in for every user, but also to mitigate harms, to mitigate risks that this can, for example, incite violence, taking into consideration one particular thing: context. Context really matters. And context is usually what machines are less good at. New AI models are trying to improve in that, taking context into account. But your problem is how you train those AI models, what data you train them on. And if that data is biased, then you will get a biased, you can increase, like make systemic bias feed it into the systems. That is why you need transparency. That is why you need oversight over any model that is built, precisely to avoid that.
Right. But Suzanne, how do you guys navigate that space of culture, right, in context, right? Just because we literally just did that conversation just now, and we all represent so many different dynamics in how we view things. How do you balance that?
It's really complicated because we do get we hear these individual cases of a piece of content, a video, a post that someone has objected to. Oftentimes it's been taken down. The poster says, what's wrong with this? This is just me expressing my political viewpoint, or this is a satirical cartoon, and why is it being removed? And then we get a lot of context about what's going on in the country or region. For example, we've had videos of conflict situations. It can be people engaging in violence, and we need to understand, what's happening in that part of Pakistan or in Gaza or Bangladesh where this is going on. At the same time, we're looking at this global platform, and we're trying to set rules that can be applied across hundreds of millions of pieces of content, knowing that, while we spend a couple of months on a case, the average content moderator is handling one in probably 15 seconds. So they're not going to know the whole history of the sectoral conflict in a particular region of the world. That can't be expected. And so we have to strike the balance between taking in that context, but also trying to put forward general rules and rules that can be applied at scale. And very often some of the nuances that we would like to bring to bear, we have to balance out, and we may not be able to. Another facet that I find fascinating about our work is we are this 22-person body from all over the world, and there are people with drastically different viewpoints. We had a recent case on the river to the sea and whether that's hate speech, and we had people, American conservatives, American progressives, people from Israel, from the Middle East, all weighing in on this decision and having a back and forth and having to look at a draft and pull it apart and make their points, look at, bring their own perspective, but also take a step back and try to understand their own biases and how those bump up against those of others. I think that is something very unique about the Oversight Board. I don't think there are many places in our society or even around the world where that kind of conversation is happening quite that way.
Louise, I'm going to bring you into the conversation then. So what exactly is the Oversight Board in relationship to Meta?
Yeah, and if we zoom out and take you back to 2018, basically Mark Zuckerberg had a light bulb moment where he was like, I just don't think that Meta should be making all of these decisions alone. And we need to empower users, and we need to empower experts to come and help us make these decisions about some of the most significant and difficult issues. So fast forward, Meta invests in a governance team, which I'm the head of, and invests heavily in this initiative, which is the Oversight Board, which was set up in 2020. But it's an independent institution, and it's been designed and structured so that they take these emblematic cases, these really the most difficult issues which deserve this amount of time and head scratching, and they make binding decisions on us. So it's like a form of self-governance that we've enacted, because we just think it's really important that when it comes to one person's free speech, which could be another person's hate speech, that we have people outside of Silicon Valley helping us make those decisions. So they make these binding decisions, which we've followed 100% of the time. But importantly, they also make these non-binding recommendations, which when you talk about context are really interesting, because these are the the recommendations that go to our policies, our products, and how we enforce our content policies that can then do more than just the individual emblematic case decision. So, for example, we were talking about context in the case of AI, but there have been decisions that the board has made which have pushed Meta to think more about how users can tell us about context of their individual decisions, because obviously we're always trying to think about scale and trying to manage the content of over 3 billion daily active users is a scale that is really hard to comprehend.
So you just mentioned 3.5 billion daily active users. I think oftentimes, particularly here in America, because a lot of these big tech companies were founded here in the United States, we often think about it from this American or Western point of view. And the dynamics is Meta operates products globally in different countries. So how does Meta, when you guys get like these binding decisions and non-binding recommendations, how do you reconcile freedom of speech versus freedom of expression, but not every country has the same rights in that we have here in America with the freedom of the speech? Each country has its own geopolitical dynamics and challenges that they have.
Yeah, I mean, and this is the complexity. But what's really interesting is there's a few different things. One, we have our global standards. So we have created over nearly 2 decades, I think, these content policies, which are basically the rules of the road for what users can and can't post on our platforms. So that's like the foundation, and they're global. Then there's like, obviously, different laws in different jurisdictions all over the world mean that we have to think about, when people are concerned that there's illegal content, how do we manage that in respect of each of the different regions and individual jurisdictions? And that's another layer. And then there's obviously international human rights across the world, which we embed into our underlying content policies. But really, that is the sweet spot of the Oversight Board. It's their ability to use that international framework of human rights and look through that lens in how they decide these most significant and difficult emblematic decisions, so that there is voice to the marginalized, and that all of those considerations are thought through. They go out and speak to public stakeholders like they do. It's a serious and kind of long form deliberative process that is about focusing on voices globally.
So Pam, with that voices globally, I kind of want to stick to that idea of 3.5 billion users, right? I kind of want to keep that thread going. The idea of language, right? And understanding context, right? So how, when you guys get cases that get brought before you, how are you guys thinking about context of language? Because language is forever dynamic, right? Even here in America, our slang is forever evolving, right? Like words don't mean what they used to. I like to use the word gang, right? Like gang on literal definition can mean, a group of individuals doing nefarious activities, right? But then if you translate that a little bit further, if you say gang, that's also to a reference of friends, right? This is just my friend, my group, my tribe, people I have brunch with on a regular basis, but that can be interpreted in so many different ways. And so with 3.5 billion users, language is always evolving. Pamela, how are you guys keeping up with context of language?
I'm going to make it even a little bit more complex. When we talk about context, we're not only talking about linguistical context. We also talk about socio-political context, economic context in a region, the openness to freedom of expression in a certain region where you have really closed media. Or we're talking about certain marginalized groups that have a differential effect on a policy that appears to be neutral. Or you have the digital context. It's not the same thing to have a harassment campaign that is coordinated and is attacking one person, that to have one specific post saying something, even if it's horrible, about one person. All these elements have to be taken into account. And of course, we're 21, we were 22, we're 21, and now we don't have enough context to be able to bring that. We bring different viewpoints, we bring different perspectives, but we go out and look for stakeholders. We open every single decision to public comments in order to actually receive information from people who can give us that context. We always reach out to experts to provide us that context, and experts in different areas, including linguistic areas. And we have seen that there are words that can sometimes mean something literally, but in certain contexts, not only can you change the words. For example, we had the Iran case where people were protesting because of the hijab laws and that were completely oppressing women. And they used a slogan to protest. And it was Mark Bar Khamenei. What does Mark Bar Khamenei mean? Literally, death to Khamenei. So death calls are prohibited. Death calls to heads of states are prohibited in Meta's platforms. But when you go into the context of Iran, when they say death to Khamenei, what they mean is down with the regime. Mm-hmm. And it's not a death call. It's not a threat. It's not something that could cause harm, but it is political speech that we have to enhance, that we have to allow people that are living in an enormous oppression to be able to speak up and to be able to denounce what is going on. And if you disallow Mark Bar Khamenei, you disenfranchise people from actually being able to get together and protest on the streets. Mm-hmm. And protest means where they're going against enormous repression. That is part of those contexts, that it's not only the linguistic, but the effect that it'll have, and the effect that it'll have in specific groups that are completely overseen many times.
So, Suzanne, with that being said, then, what, Pamela, you just laid out was very striking. I almost kind of just sat back a little bit. And what came to me, Suzanne, was the fact that whether a human or whether a machine could really tip the scale on movements and political movements that can happen in in the Middle East, because we're bringing, if it's a human and it's someone from the West, our Western principles and viewpoints on that. How then do you ensure an audience, and if you can't see me, you play the video back, I'm using my hands, how can you ensure that you don't tip the scale with your finger, that you can change the outcomes of movements?
Yeah, look, I think we also do have a sense of humility. You know, we deal with a small number of cases because we have this deliberative process. You know, we're not dictating this platform for billions, you know, what goes up and down every day. We make judgments as best we can. You know, there are so many factors that will impact the direction of the movement for women's lives and freedom in Iran. You know, access to social media, what you can post on social media is one of them. And so we take it seriously, and, you know, we try to bring a really deliberative approach to our answers and think about, you know, the implications for freedom, for rights, for other jurisdictions. You know, what would it mean if a slogan like that was used here in the United States, where it's not something commonplace? You know, would we allow that? And, you know, would there be a basis to make a distinction, or would we simply be accused of a double standard? And so there's a lot that goes into it. I would say we have a sense of respect for the Meta user base, these people out there in the world that are kind of looking to us to provide something of a voice of reason, to be, in some cases, their mouthpiece, in a sense, to push back against a company that can seem all-powerful, that in some parts of the world, it's also worth remembering, you know, here in the United States, we have SiriusXM, we have the New York Times, we have the Wall Street Journal next door, we're saturated by all sorts of media. In many parts of the world, that's not the case. And the Facebook and the Meta platforms can be almost kind of the whole internet, as much as what people have virtually the only thing that people have access to. And so in those contexts, these decisions can be enormously influential, because it's not as though people can sort of jump across, and if you can't share it on Meta, you can share it on X or on some other platform. And so that's a factor too.
I want to push back, not in a combative way, but I want to push back on the fact that, one, I want to thank you for bringing humility in it, and that you guys are humans, and humility and aspect in the decisions that you're making. But I will say, I was going to bring that into this point of view, is that Meta is a primary source for so many people. Again, we look at it from this Western point of view, that we have so many other outlets here, because American Constitution allows freedom of speech, freedom of press. We can have news almost on any channel we want. We can have competing ideology freely on broadcast and in print and in digital. But when I think about the purpose of content moderation, when I think about these other countries that don't have freedom of press, right? For some people, Facebook or other social media tools is the holy grail, right? It is their Washington Post, right? It is their SiriusXM. So there is a gravity associated with the decisions that you guys make. So Louise, I'm coming to you. When the binding, not the non-binding recommendations, when the binding decisions come to you guys, right, on what to do, that essentially is precedent in how you can move forward. How are you guys as Meta receiving that, and through what lens are you looking at it from these very consequential decisions that could, whether we like it or not, be very consequential to human rights and to political movements? This is the power of social media, and this is why so many people are in part excited for social media and big tech platforms, but also too afraid.
Yeah, it's a very important point, because oftentimes the decisions that we're making and that we're then deferring to the board to make binding decisions about content moderation do have huge impact around the world. Suzanne said that they only take a certain number of cases, and I know in comparison to the millions of content decisions that are made at Meta, it seems like a small amount, but let me just try and explain some of the impacts. So, for example, the board, you would think adult nudity would be a straightforward policy, like we're trying to make sure that there isn't pornography on the platforms, it should be straightforward. However, when you start thinking about empowering users who are perhaps breast cancer survivors, or empowering the transgender community that is thinking about discussing and fundraising for top surgery, then all of a sudden, what seems like a straightforward policy that can be applied at scale becomes way more complicated, and the board making individual decisions in those individual cases then changes our content policies and has like huge impacts across our user base. Similarly, the board have recently been doing some expedited cases, so where there is a particular conflict or crisis or need for there to be a very quick and urgent decision. They did one very recently in Venezuela, and about how users should be empowered to be able to criticize their oppressors by using language which might otherwise seem like incitement. And again, coming to Meta quickly with a decision. That decision's binding on those pieces of individual content, but then we work with our policy teams and our product teams and our enforcement teams to work out what that means. I would say one thing though, which was, you said before that part of the question around the white paper on AI is looking at whether you manage biases in human moderation. And what is super interesting about the paper is there's a lot of optimism in AI and automation actually being able to help biases and help mean that we don't make those mistakes at scale. And so it's hard because the models are trained on the data, which in itself needs to be carefully considered for biases. But there's a certain tech optimism here around how this is going to apply in content moderation and whether it's actually going to be really helpful for those marginalized voices.
I think it's important that you brought that into it with the paper, in the sense of using automation that can help expedite moderating content of 3.5 billion users. I just want to keep emphasizing that so people can understand the scale of content moderation that needs to take place, and whether or not we want to debate on whether humans should be doing it or machines could be doing it. I honestly have yet to fall on a clear decision for me on do I prefer machines or people doing content moderation, but I am recognizing the scale of it. Because of that, I do recognize that the sense of urgency. And Pam, I'm going to come to you with this, because in speaking of the white papers, and Suzanne, and speaking of some of the wonderful things that you just mentioned, the thing that stood out to me in the white paper that really talks about this sense of urgency about deep fakes and why content needs to be removed, but also too why some content needs to stay up, is the dangers that it can provide in the conservative areas of the world, right? And there was something that stood out to me, the case that you guys outlined, Pam, that I want you to give some context to. And it was around a deep fake video of a young 18-year-old woman who audience was reportedly shot dead by her father and uncle because there was a fake picture of her with a man. This was in Pakistan, in a remote Kazakhstan region. So again, when we talk about this is a global dynamic, and we often tend to look at these ideas and principles from an American point of view, from a Western point of view, we oftentimes forget that countries like Pakistan and conservative regions and areas like this that have strong religious ties, and there's such strong religious beliefs that a father is willing to shoot his daughter in the head for a fake image of her being associated with a man. So Pamela, that struck me, and so I can only imagine how it struck the oversight board. If you can give context in how you guys are navigating these type of cases.
You were right, Mike, when you said that there's deep fakes or there's AI generated disinformation or misinformation that is not particularly harmful, that can be addressed through information. I mean, if you provide the users more information, if you put labels, you can deal with that. You can make people, empower users to know what they're seeing, what they are reading, what they are hearing. But there's other contexts in which certain manipulated media or certain AI-generated content is really damaging. And it produces a real-world harm on people, not only on marginalized communities. You imagine a 14-year-old girl that has a deep fake on her with sexually implicit poses or sexually implicit actions. It will be the lever for bullying and harassment against that young girl in her school. And that's something that does not end there. Let's not go for a teenager only. Let's think of a woman public figure that is running for office. And the way to attack that woman is precisely by creating a deep fake with sexualized images or sexualized actions. That we still live in conservative countries in the world, not only in certain regions, even in the US, it is not the same to have a video of a man having sexual relationships and of a woman making it public, having sexual relationships. There is a different perspective with one another, but there's an impact that is differentiated when you have this. And when we're talking about deep fake images of sexual images, they're mostly targeting women, and they produce real world harm. What did we tell Meta in this case? One, you have to act fast. You have to identify them. You have to remove them. Two, you have to make reporting way easier. Three, the case that we saw, it had it was two cases together, one from a public figure in the States and one from a public figure in India. The public figure in the States, of course, was in the news. So Meta got the information that, through news reporting, that this was a deepfake image. So they even put it in what they call the media matching service bank, which removes automatically any image that has already been put into that bank that is similar in another post. But the India case, they didn't have news reporting. So they didn't know that that was there. And it was still a public figure. But that one was removed once the board brought it to their attention, and it was added to the media matching service bank once we brought it to their attention. Why? Because they relied on news reporting. What we told them is, if you rely on news reporting, you will benefit influential people, influential users, but you will not benefit the millions of women that can be subject to this sort of harms throughout their lives and that will not be reported in media. So take a different approach. Use the fact that it is AI generated as a signal of non-consent so that you can actually address it and you can help eliminate or mitigate these harms that do come from AI. AI is not all bad, but it does have these harms.
Well, you teed up. I want to go to Susanna on the other side of deepfakes. When you look at deepfakes or alter images that are used for satire, I often think about my favorite pastime is to watch and to view political cartoons, right? And I've always thought that was a good way to represent messages and issues and dynamics at play. Talk to us about the other side of deepfakes when it isn't necessarily for nudity or for harm, but to add value and to advance a conversation.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I think worth remembering about deepfakes and a lot of the applications of AI is that they're not fundamentally different from what we could have done even kind of with Photoshop or a satirical cartoon. They just make it so easy and so easy to replicate. And the sophistication of the replica in a deepfake is makes it very hard to detect. So when it comes to satire, it's really difficult. You know, when you talk about sort of the dilemma of, you know, do I prefer automated or human? I think ultimately the answer is going to be a combination of both. I think there's some things that AI will never be able to discern, but at the same time, when you're dealing with billions of posts, there's absolutely no way to match that with a kind of human workforce that can look at everything. And so I think the art of it is figuring out what AI can kind of sift and try to calibrate the system so that they pull out the most borderline and complex cases where, you know, it's something that normally, like let's say there's a policy at Meta against depicting or celebrating individuals from dangerous organizations, terrorist organizations. And yet there is a lot of political speech that's criticism of leaders of those organizations, that's satirical, that may be making fun of them. And you want that kind of debate to be able to happen. So Meta has these policies where if it's used in a condemnatory way, if it's being shared to raise awareness, those are exceptions to what would otherwise be a ban on, say, talking about a particular individual because they're associated with a dangerous group. But, you know, is an automated mechanism going to be discerning enough to tell whether are you actually condemning? And it's almost an arms race where there now are, there's someone coined the term malign creativity because there are ways, as the systems get more sophisticated, incorporating AI, people get more sophisticated in terms of how to work around that. They have all sorts of code words or images where they can talk about this person, and only those who are in the know are going to know that, you know, the letter H means so-and-so. And so, you know, having to evolve constantly to pick up on human adaptation and this sort of sophistication. I think that, you know, we have this incredible hunger to speak and connect and voice our opinions. And so people will naturally work around virtually any constraints that you put on them. And so, you know, that I think that burden and that challenge is only ever going to be met by some combination of the automated tools and judgment.
I like the word burden, right? And whose burden is it, you know, for this? And Louise, I want to come to you because I'm thinking about, I know here in the United States, U.S. Congresswoman Representative Yvette Clarke introduced a bill, H.R. 5586. Essentially, the bill is to protect national security against the threats posed by deepfake technology and to provide legal resources to victims in harmful deepfakes. Whose burden is this in order to remove these deepfakes and to keep all populations safe? Is it government that we see here with the legislation that's being suggested and placed on the floor within the U.S.? Is it oversight board's role? Is it Meta's role and other tech companies' burden?
I mean, I think to these sort of large societal questions with such a ever-changing, evolving landscape, there has to be a collective effort to these very serious societal questions. I think the Oversight Board was established in a bit of a vacuum where the regulation hadn't yet really come in. I think we're seeing that change. There's emerging content regulations all around the world, the Digital Services Act in Europe, but there are, I think, 72 different content regs on the books that people at Meta are very closely following along. So there's a huge push from the regulatory side, and that's adding pressure. But it's good pressure. It's what we want to see. It can't just be the decisions of private technology companies as to how we manage these trade-offs. And they are trade-offs. You know, I think we are really focused on deepfakes, especially ones that are sexually exploitative. It can have huge impact for women and girls around the world. Has to be taken very seriously. And then when you consult experts and research these issues, there's also these like other trade-off questions about self-expression and consent. And so now the board's decisions, we're still evaluating, but we're working out how we should expand our policies, how we should take into account these different forms of technology, because it has moved on since Photoshop. But we're also evaluating what consent means and what those signals should be. And it's hellish complicated, but we're here for it.
You brought up the Digital Service Act, and I was going to go there next because I wanted to
Sorry.
bring, no, this is good. I want to bring the EU into this. I brought in the U.S. perspective in our government, but I want to bring the European Union into this. An audience for those who may not be familiar with the Digital Service Act, the DSA, you often hear referred to. It's a regulation that you adopted in 2022 that addresses illegal content, transparent advertising, and disinformation. So Meta, founded in the United States, has to abide by certain governmental regulations that have the United States, but also too the EU also too has certain regulations and guidelines. How do you thread that needle between U.S. government and like the EU, let alone other governments, but for time purposes for today, the EU?
I mean, by having crazy large teams full of clever people that are trying to head scratch on these issues. But I think the Digital Services Act is the most like comprehensive of the content regulations that we're seeing come down the pipe. But there's huge regs coming out of Australia and India, out of Brazil. Like there's a bunch of different things happening at the same time, and there's a lot of overlap between them, which makes things easier, but there's also a lot of divergence because not all countries agree how content should be moderated or how stuff should show up online. What is really interesting is a lot of the focus of the DSA, which is really about ensuring that very large online platforms, which is a term coined in the legislation, that they have like extra amounts of responsibility. But it's very much focused on systems and processes and transparency and equity amongst users and user notification. And these are all things that the Oversight Board over the past 4 years has been weaving into its decisions and its non-binding recommendations. So I do like to call that out because it's an industry-leading institution that Meta led the industry in creating. We think it should be an industry standard to have that sort of accountability, notwithstanding the expense and the pain that self-regulation means. And now, of course, we have that global lens through the Oversight Board, and we have to work through the Frankenstein of jigsaw regulations around the world and how all of that is going to work in one large, giant content moderation ecosystem.
So how does that work in the sense of readiness when these different regulations come up? Like, definitely the United States government has its own challenges of getting any bill passed, not just regarding to tech policy. But then you have the EU that seems a little bit more progressively ahead when it comes to technology because they're the first ones who have the data privacy laws. We still don't have data privacy here yet. The EU just passed, and I say that now recently, legislation regulating artificial intelligence with different things. But at the time of the passing, that wasn't going to go into effect until 18 months from the time that it was passed. And we all know that technology, it advances at the rate God knows how quickly. So by the time those systems go into place, the technology would have already evolved into that. So then with the rate of technology, with the different regulations that are happening, how does Meta, from a governance perspective, prepare for the jigsaw of all those different types of regulations?
Yeah. I mean, I'm glad that you've explained it in such a head-wringing way because I think I've been thinking about the Digital Services Act for what feels like forever, but at least the last 5 or 6 years, as it's a sort of replacement for the e-commerce directive in the EU. But to answer your question, I think the issue is more around these laws are trying to be smart. They're trying to future-proof. That's why they're going in at a systems and processes level and not so much at an individual technology perspective, because they know that as soon as they come into force, they'll be fairly outdated. And so the devil is in the implementation. And we still don't know exactly how all of these different regulators around the world are going to enforce, whether the way that they're looking at regulating content moderation means that there's going to be unintended consequences. Like, we're really focused on making sure that in the desperation to comply with content regulations, we're not inadvertently over enforcing, because there's a huge, like, user rights aren't just about making sure there's privacy and that we're being very careful about online harms. How do you protect free speech? How do you become a far more regulated industry and protect free speech, and not just say, oh, we should move it all down, because otherwise we're at risk of huge like turnover fines around the world. And that's where I think this complementary ecosystem between regulation and self-regulation is so important, and why I think that an institution like the Oversight Board is complementary to this evolving regulatory landscape, because we need voices in the room who are going to say, it seems like these regulators in these countries are suggesting that in this conflict or crisis, you should just be very much leaning towards over-enforcement. But we already saw with the board's expedited cases in Israel and Hamas that there's issues around what happens when you take a far more cautious approach in conflict crisis situations. So yeah, there's a lot of unpacking to do, and I think what's clear is that we're going to be busy for the next few years trying to work out what this all looks like.
Even expediency, I want to use as a couple of numbers to bring into this conversation too as well. I talked about the unfortunate situation with the 18-year-old girl. We talked about 3.5 billion users, but I saw something really interesting too in this white paper regarding deep fakes that could have potential influence in India's election. And with that being said, there was 500 million voters that were going to it. Audience is why I keep using numbers to get us to really understand. It's easy to sit behind your computers on Twitter, Facebook, whatever social media platform you use, all the think pieces and the op-eds to criticize big tech companies, and they should be criticized and things should be critical. But this isn't a binary conversation. This isn't ones and zeros. When you are dealing with numbers in the billions, and also the potential to influence a vote, an election over 500 million people with deep fakes, this is the challenges that we all have to face. And Louise, I love how you brought into the conversation that this has to be a collaborative dynamic. Like, we have to write our think pieces, we have to be critical, we have to rally, we have to protest you guys, but we also too have to be in conversation to figure out how do we reconcile all this, not through the lens of a Western POV, and in particular, not through the lens of an American POV, when they are literally lives at stake, both in conservative countries and regions, and when elections are on the line that could be free and democratic or not free and democratic due to the rapid scale of that. With that being said, to wrap up, I guess, Pam, in closing, I'm trying to do a round robin. Where do you land, Pam, with human moderation or automated machine moderation, given what I just said?
Absolutely no doubt there has to be a combination of both. You cannot deal with the scale and the volume and the speed without using automation. But automation will not work well without human oversight, without adequate assessments, and without transparency.
Suzanne?
I agree. I think there's some judgments that, I don't believe a machine will ever be able to make. And so you want to be able to insert that human review and also to correct the systems. I mean, these systems have been stood up in a short period of time. We really don't know how they work. We've learned the lesson through social media that we don't well understand how new technologies can reshape our democracy. The expectations when Facebook first started about the impact on democracy turned out to be drastically different from what we've all lived through. And so we know we're on the cusp of something similar with AI, that there's a lot that we will not see ahead of time. And so we have to be constantly testing and reviewing and looking at the implications. We have to open it up to researchers, which is something that the Oversight Board has stressed again and again, wanting Meta to be more forthcoming in terms of the kinds of data that people can analyze so that they can do the studies and look at, who's being left out of the conversation, whose speech is being suppressed more than that of others, and how we ensure these platforms are enablers of speech and that we minimize harm.
Louise, you get the last word from the panel. this is a town hall. Everyone's going to see this. What is your hope after people listen to this and watch this? What is it you want them to take away?
Well, I'm an eternal optimist, albeit the lawyer in me makes me one that is an evidence-based optimist. But I want people to feel the optimism and not just the fear of AI. I want people to read the white paper that the board has done on AI and content moderation, and the hope around how that can mean that the way large tech companies manage these really, really grave and serious questions can be done with all the more accuracy, all the more speed, but that we have really clever people at the oversight board constantly telling us how we can improve to make sure that we don't rest on our laurels and we keep improving and evolving with these new technologies.
With that being said, Suzanne, Pam, Louise, I can't thank you enough for coming on here and having this conversation. This isn't an easy conversation to have. They're very difficult. Thank you guys for showing up and willing to answer these questions, because audience, this isn't to the purpose of this. Why I want to have this, as you know, I always talk about AI stuff, is just to enlighten and to educate and to bring more nuance into the conversation, to equip you with more data, more numbers, and tools you can have for your advocacy for or against big tech platforms. But I want us to be just more informed as we present our pros, and also too as we present our dissents. So until next time, folks, it has been an honor and pleasure. Until next time, peace.